classified document on camera, the entire room fell silent. Tim Scott couldn't say a word. What followed split the media, shifted votes in Congress, and forced America to look in the mirror. Can one woman really change an entire system built to silence voices like hers? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The double doors of room 226 opened right on time. 8:30 a.m. sharp. What followed wasn't just another hearing. It felt heavier, like something that had been building for years. Reporters shuffled in quietly, scanning their notes. Staffers whispered as they took their seats. The marble walls felt colder than usual, and the seal of the United States Congress hung above the chairman's bench like a warning. This isn't politics as usual. This is Judgment Day. Cameras from every major network, C-SPAN, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, flashed their red lights. Everyone was watching. The country wasn't just paying attention. It was holding its breath. Chairman Holt leaned into his mic. His voice was calm, but everyone could hear the edge beneath it. This is the final hearing on the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act before it goes to the full House. A quiet wave moved through the room. Even those who had heard it coming for weeks still felt the weight of it now. 3 years of debate, delays, and watered-down proposals had come to this moment. A vote was coming, and the decision would shape how America policed its own citizens for generations. Jasmine Crockett sat at one end of the table, composed but tense. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white. She didn't need to look around to feel the room watching her. They always watched her, but rarely listened. Across from her was Senator Tim Scott, carefully adjusting the gold pin on his lapel. His expression was unreadable, but Jasmine could see it in his eyes. He came prepared to push back. They weren't just two lawmakers. They were two symbols, two sides of a fight that had split the country wide open. Jasmine wore a simple dark blazer, no jewelry except a small silver ring, engraved with the initials J.A. Her cousin, Jamal Anderson, shot by police at a traffic stop. They said they thought he had a weapon. He was 17. She never forgot. She never forgave. Tim Scott looked polished in his Navy suit, papers neatly stacked in front of him. He wasn't here to deny pain, but he believed change had to come slowly, carefully, without tearing down what he saw as the foundation of order. Jasmine didn't see order. She saw a system that chose silence over justice. The chairman spoke again. Each of you will have 5 minutes for your opening statements. Jasmine inhaled once, slow and deep. 5 minutes. That's all she had to speak for the names etched into protest signs, for the parents who never got answers, for the kids who learned early what it meant to be watched, feared, punished. She wasn't here to play safe. She was here because someone had to say what others wouldn't. Tim Scott leaned forward slightly, pen in hand. He was ready for a debate. Jasmine wasn't. She was ready for a reckoning. She didn't move. She didn't flinch. But inside, Jasmine could feel the weight of the moment coiling tighter, like a spring wound to the edge. The chairman had barely finished his sentence when Tim Scott leaned forward, pressed the button on his mic, and began to speak. Not with anger, but with control. The kind of control honed through years in halls like this. The kind that sounded calm, even when it was about to dismiss someone else's reality. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, he began. Let me start by saying what many of us already know. The overwhelming majority of police officers in this country, 99%, wake up every day to serve and protect. They don't wake up looking to harm anyone. There it was, the number. 99%. Clean, reassuring, sanitized. Jasmine's jaw tensed, but she didn't interrupt. Not yet. Tim's voice was steady, measured, deliberate. Do we have problems? Yes. Do we have work to do? Absolutely. But let's not throw gasoline on the fire by tearing down the very institutions that keep our neighborhoods safe. We don't need to defund the police. We need to fund better training, better tools, better oversight. He paused for effect, scanning the room. We don't fix the system by dismantling it. We fix it by investing in it. Because reform, real reform, means supporting those who put on the badge and take the risk every single day. Applause didn't break out, but a few nods moved down the Republican bench. To them, it sounded reasonable. rational, balanced. But to Jasmine, it sounded like denial wrapped in a velvet ribbon. Because behind that 1% he mentioned so casually lay graves. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Thousands. Some never even got names. The room was still digesting his words when Jasmine shifted. It was subtle, just a lean, a breath, but it hit like a shift in air pressure before a storm. No one told her to speak. She didn't ask. She stood, not slowly, not theatrically. She rose the way someone does when they've waited too long to sit still. Her chair scraped back against the marble floor with a sharp, unfiltered sound that cut through the silence like a blade. All eyes turned to her, not out of curiosity but instinct. Something had changed. Something was about to be said that no one could ignore. She stepped forward, her voice low but clear enough to carve through stone. 1%, she repeated, not as a question, but as a warning. 1% of officers with the power to kill an innocent person without consequence means the other 99% lose all meaning. The words didn't echo. They landed. Heavy, hard, final. The room went quiet, the kind of quiet that follows something undeniable. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words carried weight because they came from truth, not volume. She looked directly at Senator Scott, then scanned the dais. We are not talking about paperwork errors. We're talking about bodies, people, children, men with wallets mistaken for weapons, women killed in their sleep, mothers with empty arms and no closure. Her hands were still at her sides, but her entire body seemed to speak. If even 1% of airplanes crashed, we'd ground the fleet. If 1% of surgeons killed patients on the table, we'd shut down hospitals. But with policing, we argue over funding while families bury their sons. She paused, not for drama, for air, for restraint, for control, and then quieter. So no, Senator. 99% is not good enough. If 1% can murder without justice. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched, thick, tense, electric. Even the cameras seemed to lean in, as if the room itself had stopped breathing. But then, Tim Scott reached for his stack of papers. He didn't raise his voice either. He didn't need to. His power was in the numbers, in the illusion of neutrality. With all due respect, he began, pressing one finger to the top sheet, the data tells a fuller story. His voice was calm, professional, even empathetic. But behind the tone was something colder. Control, not dominance, not rage, just control. It was the kind of voice people trusted on TV, the kind of voice that made uncomfortable truths sound negotiable. He sat upright, spine straight, shoulders set, and continued. According to a DOJ review of 2023 arrest records, use of force incidents have actually declined by 17% nationwide. Black Americans make up 13% of the population, but in most urban departments, force is applied at rates proportionate to the crime index. He paused there, not to breathe, but to let the numbers settle. As if they were enough, as if they explained everything. No one interrupted him. No one looked satisfied either. The room had grown colder somehow, brighter, as if the facts themselves had drained the human weight out of the air. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't look away, but something behind her eyes tightened, a flash of disbelief so sharp it could cut steel. Tim didn't flinch. He went on, flipping to the next page like a teacher reviewing a lesson. These are facts, not feelings. We have to be careful not to confuse injustice with anecdote. The words fell with soft edges but heavy intent. They were meant to sound wise, measured, mature. But to those who had lived on the wrong end of a badge, they sounded like sandpaper against the truth. Still, he kept going. In a 2024 study by the National Police Foundation, he continued, lifting the next document slightly for effect, 82% of surveyed officers reported receiving implicit bias training, and over 90% passed standardized accountability reviews. That's progress. Another pause, another look across the room. His eyes met Jasmine's now, steady and unshaken. It may not be perfect, but we are not a nation of systemic racists. We are a nation working toward balance. He let that final sentence land slowly, like a closing door. He folded his hands and sat back, confident he had done what he came to do. Calm the fire with charts, replace grief with graphs. For some in the room, it worked. For others, it only made the silence heavier. Because numbers don't cry, numbers don't bleed, numbers don't knock on a mother's door at 2:13 a.m. to say her son won't be coming home. As Tim Scott's final words faded, "We are a nation working toward balance." Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still for a beat longer than anyone expected. Long enough to let his message hang in the air. Long enough for people to think maybe she'd nod, maybe she'd respond politely, maybe she'd move on. She didn't. Instead, she leaned forward, slow and deliberate, like someone who wasn't just responding to an argument, but loading live ammunition. Her hands moved with a strange, eerie calm, like she'd rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind, but waited for just the right silence to fire it. And then, something no one expected. She smiled, not wide, not kind. It was the smallest, tightest curve of her lips. A smile that didn't say, "Thank you for your point," but rather, "You just walked into it." "Senator Scott," she said, her voice quiet, composed, almost gentle, "you forgot one statistic, the one you didn't publish." Every head turned, cameras locked in, staffers froze mid-gesture. Even the chairman sat back in his seat with a barely concealed alertness. Jasmine turned to her laptop, already connected to the main display. Her fingers moved with confidence, no hesitation, no theatrics, just purpose. She clicked once, then once more, and the large screen behind the dais came to life. A file opened. Black background, white text. June 4th, 2024, Columbia, South Carolina. Body cam footage, internal review file. She tapped the spacebar. The room fell silent as the video began. First static, then a jump cut to raw body cam footage. The scene was disorienting. Loud voices, shaky movement, flashing lights from a gas station canopy overhead. A black man, mid-30s, hands raised, backing away slowly, confused but not aggressive. One officer shouted, "Get down!" Another screamed, "Stop resisting!" before the man had moved an inch. Then came the takedown, fast, violent. Two officers. One drove a knee into the man's back, the other pushed his face into the pavement. Then, the knee shifted higher, onto his neck. 17 seconds passed, then 20, then 32. His breathing became erratic. His voice cracked, panicked, strained, calling for air. "I can't," and then nothing. His body stopped moving. His eyes were open but lifeless, and the footage kept going. The officers stood, walked away. No CPR, no panic, just silence. The room cracked. A sharp gasp rippled across the hearing chamber, first from a young aide seated near the back, then from a veteran representative who instinctively reached for his glasses like they could shield him from what he'd just seen. Several people physically recoiled. Someone whispered, "Oh my God," but the mic didn't pick it up. Reporters began typing so fast the sound of keys became its own rhythm. No one tried to interrupt. No one dared. The screen went dark. Jasmine turned back toward the room, but her focus was laser-locked on one person, Tim Scott. Her voice was clear now, controlled. But beneath it was something harder, sharper, pain that had been ground into steel. "That was Marcus Lane," she said calmly. 36 years old, father of two. Wrong place. No weapon. No charges." She let it sink in. A few people instinctively glanced down at their notes, as if afraid to meet her eyes. Others couldn't look away. "And no statement from your office. Not even after we sent the footage directly to your staff." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every syllable hit like a hammer wrapped in velvet. Her hands were still, her posture steady, her presence unshakable. "You want to talk data?" she said, her voice narrowing like a scalpel. "That was your district. That was your silence." And just like that, the entire dynamic shifted. The statistics were gone. The talking points were dust. Now there was only the truth, raw, on tape, and undeniable. The room was still spinning from the footage when Jasmine inhaled, slow, deliberate, like someone forcing herself to keep breathing in a space that had stolen air from her lungs more than once. The silence hadn't broken. The cameras were still blinking. Phones were still buzzing in coat pockets. But Jasmine's voice returned, not louder, not faster, just heavier, weighted, controlled like the steady pull of gravity before something drops. And this time, she didn't point to the screen. She pointed to her own past. "You want to talk about patterns?" she asked, her voice low but unmistakably sharp. She wasn't raising a question. She was drawing a line. "Then let me give you one that doesn't come from a spreadsheet." Her eyes didn't scan the room. She focused straight ahead, as if the story was too real to risk diffusing it across too many faces. She pressed her fingertips against the table, grounding herself, steadying the memory before releasing it. "My uncle, his name was Terrence Crockett, was walking home from his second shift at the mill when two officers pulled up and demanded to see his ID. Her voice didn't waver, but something behind it did, like a bruise being touched again for the first time in years. He asked one question, just one. She raised her hand, palm out, slow and calm, like she was replaying it frame by frame. "What did I do wrong?" That's all he said. A beat passed. No one moved. No one could. Some looked down instinctively, sensing what was coming next but not knowing how to brace for it. "And for that," she continued, "they slammed his head into the hood of the cruiser, broke 3 ribs, ruptured a disc in his spine." The words didn't rise, they fell, hard and cold and irrefutable. She didn't look for sympathy. She wasn't asking for it. She was documenting it. "He never walked the same again. He still can't tie his own shoes." One or two staffers shifted uncomfortably. A representative on the far side of the room blinked slowly, lips slightly parted, suddenly unsure how anyone could pivot from this. Jasmine let the silence come again, but not for long. "We filed a complaint," she said, now pulling a thick manila folder from her bag. It was frayed around the corners, stained near the edges, overstuffed and bent like it had been carried too many times without ever being opened. "Sent it to Internal Affairs. Sent it to the State Attorney General." She held it up not like evidence, but like a wound. 7 years. The words hung like a sentence. A life sentence, really. 7 years of silence, of letters unanswered, of evidence ignored, of this case being passed around like a virus no one wanted to catch. Then, without drama, she dropped the file flat onto the table. The sound wasn't loud, but in the room's breathless stillness, it echoed. Not just off the walls, but in people's throats, in their conscience. "That's the justice some of us are told to believe in," she said, voice now sharpened like a courtroom blade. "That's the system some of you are here to protect." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words had already raised the stakes higher than anyone expected, and higher than anyone, especially Tim Scott, could safely walk back from. The folder Jasmine dropped still sat on the table, like a silent brick of truth, undeniable, unmoved, unforgotten. Around it, no one made a sound. Even the rustling of notes and the subtle hum of electronics seemed to vanish. Across the table, Tim Scott sat still, his hands clasped tightly together, eyes fixed not on Jasmine, not on the cameras, but on something internal. His throat moved just slightly. He wasn't flipping pages anymore. He wasn't pointing at data. He wasn't defending a policy or quoting a report. For several long seconds, Tim Scott was just a son remembering. Then finally he raised his eyes. There was no smirk, no strategy, just stillness. He spoke slowly, without a script. "My mother," he began, "was robbed at knife point when I was 9 years old." The words dropped gently, but they didn't fall flat. They shifted the room in a different way, not with fire, but with something more unexpected. Vulnerability. He looked at no one in particular, as if the story lived outside the walls of the hearing room, somewhere back in time, somewhere it never stopped playing. "It was just before Christmas," he continued, the corner of his mouth tightening with memory. "She was working the closing shift at the diner, walking to the bus stop when a man grabbed her from behind and pressed a knife to her neck." No one moved. Jasmine didn't interrupt. Not because she agreed, but because something deeper was happening. A wound was being shown, and wounds, especially the real ones, command a certain kind of silence. "She managed to scream," he said, eyes narrowing with the image. and a patrol car, parked down the block, heard her. They were there in less than 20 seconds. They tackled him. They got the knife away. She came home that night, shaking, crying, but alive. His voice didn't tremble, but it wasn't smooth either. It was a voice that carried dust, time, reality. He let the silence return, not for dramatic effect, but because it was necessary. The weight of the memory demanded space, and when he finally spoke again, it was with a kind of plain-spoken truth that made even the cameras seem to back off. And for me, the badge meant safety. It meant someone would come when you screamed. That was it. No argument, no denial, no erasure of Jasmine's pain. Just another truth, laid bare. But that single sentence, it meant someone would come when you screamed, sat in the air like a dividing line between two Americas. One where protection arrived in 20 seconds, and another where 7 years of paperwork still hadn't brought a single response. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't challenged her facts. But in those quiet, unwavering words, Tim Scott exposed the sharpest difference of all. Not belief, not ideology, but experience. And that difference was enough to shake the room all over again. The room had barely begun to recover from the quiet war of memories between Jasmine and Tim when it happened. Sudden, sharp, and completely tone-deaf. A conservative congressman seated near the edge of the dais shifted in his chair and leaned forward toward his mic. His name wasn't important, but his smirk was. He adjusted his cuff as if preparing for a press conference, not a reckoning. He had been quiet through most of the hearing, arms folded, occasionally sighing, clearly irritated by the emotional weight in the room. But now he had decided it had gone too far. Or maybe, from where he sat, it had never meant anything at all. And so, with the careless confidence of someone who'd never been followed by a patrol car without reason, he said it. "If you're not happy with the police," he said flatly, "you're free to move somewhere else." The words didn't just break the silence. They violated it, like a car alarm going off in a church. The effect was instant. Several heads snapped toward him. A staffer near the media box instinctively let out a quiet, "What?" under her breath. One of the younger aides closed his laptop a little too hard, trying not to react visibly. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. The insult didn't surprise her. It never did. What made this moment different was that it was spoken into a microphone, on the record, under the seal of Congress, in a hearing meant to address the death of a man who couldn't breathe. Her face didn't twist. She didn't raise her eyebrows. Her response was not theatrical, it was ancestral. A different kind of weight moved through her body, and with a sudden, thunderous bang, her palms slammed flat against the table. The sound echoed, short, sharp, final. A few papers jumped. A glass near the stenographer vibrated audibly. Even the cameras, those emotionless eyes blinking red, seemed to flinch. She stood up so quickly, the chair behind her slid an inch across the floor. She didn't lean toward the mic. She didn't need to. Her voice carried like something that had been waiting too long to speak. "I was born here," she said, each word as grounded as stone. "I'm not a guest." Her tone wasn't loud, but it was exact. It carried the weight of generations who had been told to go somewhere else after building the very nation they were being asked to leave. No one moved, not even the congressman who had spoken. He leaned back slightly now, blinking like he hadn't expected the table to hit back. From across the horseshoe, Tim Scott exhaled, a long, visible breath, like someone watching a fire approach a line of gasoline. He didn't reach for his papers. He didn't check his phone. He just leaned forward and said quietly, without challenge, without bite, "Don't let emotion kill reason." It wasn't an attack. It was something else. Fatigue, perhaps. A plea. An echo of the belief that if everyone stayed calm, maybe something could be salvaged. But in that moment, it only made the divide sharper. Jasmine turned to him, slowly. Her expression didn't harden. It deepened, like someone who had looked reason in the eye once and found nothing there. Her stare was still. Her voice, lower now, came out like a slow drum beat pulled from the ground. "I saw blood before I ever saw reason." And with that, everything stopped. There were no gasps, no keyboard clacks, Only stillness. Because everyone in the room, for one terrifying second, understood. This wasn't just a policy debate. This was what it felt like when history stepped into the room and refused to sit down. The tension in the chamber had thickened to the point of suffocation. Jasmine's words, "I saw blood before I ever saw reason," were still vibrating in the bones of everyone present, like the final chord of a requiem refusing to fade. The chairman hadn't banged his gavel. The cameras hadn't blinked away. And no one, not even the congressman who suggested she leave the country, had dared to speak again. It was Jasmine who moved first, but she didn't shout. She didn't flinch. She opened a manila folder with the same calm as someone lighting a match in a room full of gas. "This hearing has heard statistics, personal stories, claims of bias and claims of progress," she said, her voice steady, unshaken. "But there's one thing we haven't heard yet. Truth from the inside." She pulled out a thin document, stamped restricted, the kind of stamp that screams louder than any headline. She held it in the air, not for effect, but for accountability. "This is a leaked internal memo from the FBI's Civil Rights Division, dated February 2025. Her tone darkened by a degree, sharp enough to quiet even the reporters now hovering at the edge of their seats. It outlines that 27% of police departments surveyed admitted to having an informal, unwritten policy of not pursuing internal investigations into racial violence by officers, especially when the victims are Black or Latino. Gasps erupted, some muffled, some sharp. The chairman leaned forward, as if uncertain whether to intervene or take notes. Staffers froze mid-gesture. One aide dropped his pen. Jasmine placed the report on the witness table, then turned to the screen behind her. The red lights of the media cameras blinked in perfect rhythm, as if keeping time with the unraveling of a system no longer able to hide. She clicked once. The screen behind her illuminated with the memo's header. "Confidential, FBI Field Report, Internal Compliance and Ethics Trends in Urban Police Agencies." Below that, paragraph after paragraph of sobering language appeared. Retaliation for reporting racial bias appears not only tolerated, but structurally enabled in nearly 1/3 of departments surveyed. Jasmine didn't need to explain it. The document spoke for itself. "We talk about bad apples," she said, now facing the room again. "But what do you call it when the orchard is designed to bury the roots?" Tim Scott leaned forward, his face unreadable, jaw clenched. For the first time, he looked like someone trying to choose his words as carefully as someone crossing a frozen lake. "That document," he said slowly, "is deeply concerning, but it represents behavior, individual behavior, not policy, not intent. These are isolated cases, not systemic doctrine. We can't conflate isolated misconduct with the entire institution. That would be unjust to the many departments doing it right." The response sounded reasonable, at least on paper. It was calm, measured, like a lifeline tossed into a storm. But Jasmine didn't reach for it. She took a breath, not to calm down, but to steady the truth in her chest. "Isolated?" she repeated softly, then turned back to her laptop. Click. A new slide filled the screen. 5 states, 15 incidents, identical outcomes. California, Texas, Georgia, Illinois, Pennsylvania. Each listed with the date of the complaint, the name of the victim, the department involved, and a chillingly identical final note. No internal investigation pursued. Case closed with no officer reprimanded. Victim cited for noncompliance. Click. Now the screen showed faces, photos of the victims. Some were mugshots, others were social media pictures cropped from birthday cakes and graduations. Young men, older women, one boy who looked no older than 12, all Black, all filed reports, none received justice. Jasmine stepped aside, letting the screen speak in silence for a moment longer. "I didn't make this list up," she said finally. "These are from DOJ records and civil lawsuits that never made it past discovery because the officers in question were shielded by qualified immunity, or worse, internal silence." She turned back to Scott, her eyes unwavering. "Tell me, is it still isolated when 5 separate states, under 5 different governors, show the same pattern, same phrasing, same buried reports? Scott didn't speak immediately. He didn't have to. The room said it for him. The pattern wasn't hidden anymore. It was on display. It had names, dates, faces. Jasmine's voice dropped, not in volume, but in weight. This isn't about hating the police. This is about naming the silence. And silence, she said, tapping the report with a single finger, has a structure. Reporters were no longer writing. They were filming live. Twitter feeds exploded outside the chamber. Structured silence began trending within 4 minutes. On the House feed, viewers flooded the comments with names. Say his name, say her name. And one sentence began spreading like wildfire across news sites. We talk about bad apples, but what do you call it when the orchard is designed to bury the roots? Inside the room, the atmosphere was no longer just tense. It was transformed. No one was thinking about 5-minute speaking limits or polite yield of time exchanges. What Jasmine had laid bare wasn't just misconduct, it was method. Not just pain, but pattern. And in that moment, the hearing had crossed a line it couldn't walk back from. And yet, even as the hearing room stood tense and still, the real eruption wasn't happening inside those walls. It was happening outside them. Jasmine Crockett's final words had barely faded before the first clips began circulating. 30-second video snippets, cut from the live broadcast and uploaded to social media with captions that bled emotion. I saw blood before I ever saw reason. I was born here. I'm not a guest. In less than 10 minutes, 2 hashtags began rising. First slowly, then like a tidal wave smashing every timeline. Let her speak and back the blue. By the top of the hour, both were trending nationally. By the end of the day, they were being spoken aloud in newsrooms, classrooms, coffee shops, and war rooms on both sides of the aisle. Let her speak became a rallying cry for those demanding police reform, accountability, and space for voices like Jasmine's. Black, female, unafraid. Her supporters flooded social platforms with videos of her testimony, excerpts of the FBI memo, and images of Marcus Lane and the folder she had dropped with surgical precision. It wasn't just politics now. It was personal. But at the exact same time, Back the Blue was surging too, fueled by conservative influencers, police unions, and law and order politicians warning against what they called emotional sabotage of institutional stability. They clipped Tim Scott's calm responses and pushed sound bites like, "Don't let emotion kill reason," as proof that restraint, not passion, was the adult in the room. For every clip of Jasmine slamming her hand on the table, there was a stitched video calling it radical theater. 2 realities, 2 truths, 1 boiling country. Television didn't wait long to join the fight. That evening, CNN opened its primetime coverage with a chilling headline. 27% of departments look the other way. Jasmine Crockett demands justice. Meanwhile, Fox News ran with, "Outburst on the Hill, Crockett versus Reason. Is Congress listening to chaos?" On MSNBC, the leaked FBI memo was front and center, read aloud with grainy footage of the victims Jasmine named. On Newsmax, a guest host claimed the document was questionable at best, and that Crockett was dismantling public trust for retweets. No one aired the full hearing. Every outlet chose moments. The clips that made their case, confirmed their narrative, moved their base, and the base was moving, fast. In Chicago, a spontaneous rally formed in front of a federal courthouse, dozens holding signs with Jasmine's face in the words, "Not a guest, a citizen." In Dallas, a crowd gathered near a local police department with banners reading, "Justice means action, not apologies." At the same time, a counter-protest was forming in Raleigh, where a line of supporters wearing American flag gear waved thin blue line flags and chanted, "Protect those who protect us." The divide wasn't coming. It was already here, and Congress felt it like a noose tightening around the vote count. By morning, the inboxes of dozens of representatives, especially those from swing districts, were overflowing. Thousands of emails, voicemails, comments, demands, threats, pleas. Constituents who had never written a lawmaker before were now flooding their elected officials with messages that started with, "I saw the video," or, "After yesterday, I need to know where you stand." Chiefs of staff were pulling extra interns just to triage the onslaught. Behind closed doors, the conversation began to change. Some moderate Democrats who had quietly planned to abstain from the vote on the George Floyd Act were now reconsidering. I didn't expect this to explode like that. Republicans who had once dismissed the bill as symbolic suddenly faced a public relations nightmare. Town halls were being rescheduled, fundraisers were being paused. The phones just wouldn't stop ringing. One staffer from a Midwestern Republican's office, speaking off record, admitted, "We thought we could sit this one out. Now our own base is split. Half are shouting, 'Back the blue,' and the other half are asking why Tim Scott had no answer for that FBI memo." Internally, party strategists began circulating data showing that black voter turnout was climbing steadily online, even in red counties. Donors on both sides started calling, not to offer money, but to ask for answers. In real time, politicians began issuing new statements, not apologies, repositionings. Language like, "We continue to evaluate the bill with great seriousness," replaced previous tweets calling it anti-police. One congressman who'd previously said, "We don't negotiate with activists," quietly deleted the tweet, and by noon had posted, "Every voice deserves to be heard." I look forward to reviewing all aspects of the George Floyd Act with my colleagues. It wasn't a revolution, not yet, but it was a signal. The hearing had changed something, not just what people believed, but what they were willing to say aloud. And at the center of it all was a woman in a charcoal blazer, standing in a room where she had not just spoken, but shifted the room's gravity. Jasmine, for her part, said nothing to the press. She walked past reporters with the same posture she had in the chamber. Steady, measured, unbothered by the storm because she had already walked through the fire. But across every news app in America, her image was there. The quote was there. The line was there. "I was born here. I'm not a guest." And just beneath it, in different fonts and colors depending on your screen, "Let her speak back." The blue two sides of the same country, watching the same moment and seeing something very different. But just when it seemed the room had absorbed the worst of the storm, the door at the back of the chamber creaked open, slowly, without announcement, without pretense. The timing was strange. The chairman glanced toward his aide, confused. There was no one else scheduled to speak, but the man who entered walked with purpose, not hesitation. He was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, but not threatening. His suit was modest. His eyes, red around the edges, scanned the room not with defiance, but with something closer to guilt. A whisper moved through the chamber like a current. One staffer leaned into another and mouthed, "Who is that?" Jasmine's eyes narrowed. She'd never seen him before. Neither had Tim Scott. But the chairman, after glancing at a last-minute note placed in front of him, cleared his throat and said quietly, "Mr. Derek Callahan, former officer of the Arlington Police Department, has requested to make a personal statement. He is the final witness for today." A few members shifted. The air changed again. Callahan stepped up to the microphone. He didn't have papers, no binder, just shaking hands and a face that looked like it hadn't slept in weeks. He took a deep breath, let it out slow, and then began. Not like someone delivering testimony, but like someone trying to drag a truth out of his own chest before it choked him. "I was a cop for 18 years, he said. 2 different departments. No write-ups, no lawsuits. I got promoted. People trusted me." Silence. "And I thought I was one of the good ones." His voice cracked slightly at that last word. "I told myself that every day. Even when I looked away from things. Even when I laughed at the jokes other guys made in the locker room. Even when I let a black teenager cry in the back seat of my cruiser because I followed protocol." No one moved. "I want to tell you something I was never supposed to say out loud," he continued, eyes locked straight ahead. We were trained, to see black men as threats. That's not in the handbook. That's not official, but it's real. I was told that if a black man runs, assume he's guilty. If he talks back, assume he's dangerous. If he twitches, assume he's armed." He swallowed hard, and then came the sentence that broke the room. "I was taught that being black meant being a threat." A few people audibly gasped. Someone near the back dropped a pen. Even the stenographer paused mid-keystroke. Callahan's voice trembled now, but he didn't stop. I carried that into every traffic stop, every sidewalk encounter, every time I touched my radio. And I didn't know how wrong it was until the day I cuffed a 14-year-old boy outside a gas station for looking at me too long. He cried the whole time. He was holding Skittles. Jasmine's eyes welled, but she didn't blink. She didn't look down. She just watched. Every word this man said landed like an arrow into the truth she had been trying to make them see for years. Callahan took another breath, but it broke halfway through. His voice collapsed with it. I left the force 2 years ago. I started therapy. I don't sleep much. My kids ask me what I did for a living, and I changed the subject. Then he looked up, right at Jasmine. I watched you today, he said, and I want to say something I never got to say to the kids I pulled over. Or their parents, or that boy with the Skittles. A pause, his voice was raw. I'm sorry. That's when Jasmine's tears finally fell. Not because she hadn't heard stories like this before, but because it had never been spoken like this. In this room, by someone who had worn the badge. She wiped her cheek once, quickly, and stayed standing. Across the table, Tim Scott looked down, his hands folded tightly, the corners of his mouth trembling slightly. There was no political response for this. No pivot, no calculation, only quiet. And then, without instruction, the entire chamber rose. One by one they stood. Democrats, Republicans, interns, committee clerks, even the reporters in the back. Not clapping, not speaking, just standing. The kind of silence that says, "We heard you," the kind that doesn't need permission. Callahan stepped back from the mic. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He just nodded once, wiped his own face, and walked out the same way he entered. Quietly, no cameras chasing, no titles attached. But the impact remained. It hung in the air like a final chord that no one wanted to mute. And Jasmine? She stayed standing too, hands still, breath slow, eyes fixed on the empty microphone. Because for the first time in the entire hearing, someone else had said it for her. The silence after the former officer's confession lingered long after he left the room. Even as people slowly sat down, the gravity didn't dissipate. It thickened, settled into the bones of everyone present. Jasmine remained standing for a moment longer, breathing in slow, measured beats, as if giving the room one last second to process what had just happened. Then quietly she sat. Across the table, Tim Scott did the same. He didn't speak right away. Neither did she. For once, the stillness between them didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt like something else, something closer to recognition. Not agreement, but acknowledgement. The chairman cleared his throat, unsure how to continue, when Tim finally leaned forward. His voice was low but direct. I believe in accountability, he said. I always have. But today made it clear. We need stronger tools to ensure it. Jasmine looked at him, not with suspicion, not with warmth either, but with the weary caution of someone who's seen promises come and go. What tools? She asked plainly. Tim didn't hesitate. Mandatory body cameras, not just funded, required. Every officer, every shift, no exceptions. A few heads in the room turned. That wasn't nothing. Jasmine studied his face, searching for hesitation. There was none, so she replied, not with emotion, but with precision. An oversight, she said. Cameras mean nothing without independent review. I want a federal monitor for departments that fail accountability audits. Someone who doesn't answer to their chain of command? Tim exhaled, nodded once. Independent oversight, he repeated. I can accept that. That was the first crack in the wall between them. Jasmine shifted in her chair, eyes narrowing slightly. Not in challenge, but in calculation. Then I'll make a concession, she said. Your community policing program, the pilot you've been pushing for 2 years in South Carolina, I'll support its inclusion in the bill, but with civilian review baked in. No blank checks. Tim blinked, surprised but not displeased. That's non-negotiable, he replied. Civilians will be at the table from the start. Another silence followed, but this time it wasn't tense. It was active. The kind of silence where gears begin to move. Around the room, staffers began whispering. Aides pulled up shared language drafts. The chairman leaned back, eyebrows raised. "Are you telling me," he said, half incredulous, "you two just found common ground?" Jasmine spoke before Tim could. "We didn't agree," she said flatly. "We built a trench wide enough to meet in the middle." Tim nodded. "We're still standing on different sides," he added, "but we're not throwing rocks anymore." And with that, the impossible began to take shape. A new version of the bill emerged on paper within hours. It didn't carry Jasmine's full vision. It didn't reflect Tim's perfect ideal. But it did include mandatory body-worn cameras for all federal and local officers receiving federal funds, with clear disciplinary frameworks for failure to record use-of-force interactions. It included independent oversight boards, selected in part by civil rights organizations, to audit departments that fail annual bias or misconduct assessments. It retained Tim Scott's community partnership training program, but added citizen accountability layers, transparency reporting, and performance metrics that would be published publicly. Neither side got everything, but both got something worth defending. Still, the tension remained. Jasmine sat with the draft for nearly an hour, reviewing each line like a contract written in scars. She circled a clause that allowed for data to be sealed in ongoing investigations, and pushed for an amendment to limit that clause to 30 days. Tim pushed back gently, asking for 60. They met at 45. She pushed again for trauma-informed training to be expanded to include not just active officers, but academy recruits. He agreed, but insisted on a provision that no officer could be decertified solely on unverified accusations. Jasmine frowned, then added a clause, unless a pattern is found across 3 or more cases. Another nod. It was a brutal kind of compromise, but it was real. By nightfall, the first joint statement was drafted, short, measured, and shocking in its very existence. "We do not agree on everything, but we agree that inaction is no longer an option. This bill is a first step toward rebuilding trust and protecting lives." Representative Jasmine Crockett and Senator Tim Scott. The statement hit the news before midnight. Some activists were furious. "Not strong enough, Ciorena," they said. "Where's the justice for past victims?" Some conservatives accused Tim of folding to pressure. But in the middle, the messy, angry, aching middle, something remarkable was happening. Members of both parties who had refused to be in the same room the day before were now reviewing the joint proposal. Cautiously, reluctantly. But they were reading it. And Jasmine? She sat in her office past 2 a.m., staring out at the Capitol dome glowing in the dark like a hollow promise. She didn't smile. She didn't relax. But she did close her laptop slowly and whisper to herself, more prayer than victory. Not everything, but maybe enough. It happened in near silence. The final votes came in one by one. Green and red lights blinking across the digital board above the speaker's dais like the pulse of a divided nation. Members sat forward in their chairs, some whispering prayers, others clutching note cards like lifelines. Staffers hovered near the edge of the gallery, phones in hand, ready to post the moment the numbers locked. Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the screen, her face still, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles blanched. Tim Scott, seated 3 rows behind, leaned forward on his elbows, eyes narrowed, not in victory, but in waiting. Then came the final count, a narrow line, 217 to 213. For a moment, no one breathed. Then the speaker's voice cut through the air like a gavel made of thunder. "The motion passes. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, amended, has been adopted by the House." The chamber broke into fragmented applause. Not a roar, more like an exhale from people who had been holding it for too long. Reporters raced to file stories before the ink dried. Phones lit up across the country. The crawl on CNN read, "Breaking House passes historic policing reform after heated negotiations." On MSNBC, a new era of accountability begins. And on Fox, controversial reform bill squeaks through the House. Outside, crowds gathered in front of Capitol Hill erupted in cheers, some with tears, others waving signs that said, "Justice isn't charity, and this is just the start." But inside, at the heart of it all, Jasmine Crockett remained seated, Her jaw was clenched, her eyes glassy but unshed. When a reporter shouted from the gallery, "Congresswoman Crockett, is this a victory?" She didn't answer right away. She stood slowly, walked up to the podium, and let the silence settle around her one last time before she spoke. "Changing laws is the easy part," she said, her voice even, sharp as cut glass. "But laws don't bleed. People do. And until the hearts behind the badges, behind the benches, behind the microphones, until those hearts change, this isn't justice. This is just paperwork." The room froze again. Some clapped. Most just listened, because the truth didn't need volume. It just needed someone willing to say it without blinking. "Don't call this the end of a chapter," she continued. "Call it the start of a harder one." Then she stepped back. No smile, no handshake, just truth, dropped like a gavel of her own. Across the room, Tim Scott rose too. He didn't head for the cameras. He didn't make a statement. He simply gathered his binder, adjusted his lapel, and started walking toward the exit. No entourage, no pageantry. But his steps were slow, measured. The kind of walk of a man who knows he helped build something, only to realize it's nowhere near finished. As he passed the empty front bench where Callahan had stood, he glanced once at the chair, then quickly looked away. Jasmine didn't follow him with her eyes. She didn't need to. She knew where he stood. She knew he'd carry this day on his shoulders for longer than any news cycle. Above them, on the gallery wall, the words carved into the marble watched like a warning. Equal justice under law. But both of them knew what the cameras would never catch. The law had moved, but the country had not. Outside the chamber, a crowd had already begun chanting. Some cried, some danced, some simply stared up at the Capitol with the weary hope of people who've been let down before. Journalists flooded the rotunda. Headlines were being written faster than votes had been cast. One read, "Jasmine Crockett, from witness to architect of reform." Another countered, "Scott and Crockett find fragile compromise in historic bill." But none captured the moment better than Jasmine's own words, already being quoted, stitched, tweeted, and turned into protest signs. "Changing laws is not enough if the heart hasn't changed." And inside, as the last members filed out, the chamber stood still. Not in triumph, not in relief, but in something harder to name, a fragile beginning made of paper, pain, and just enough courage to keep going. And even after the final gavel dropped, the marble chamber did not breathe. The bill had passed, barely. The vote count had lit up the digital screen like an exhausted heartbeat. 217 to 213. It was over. On paper. But paper doesn't bleed. Paper doesn't remember the names. And as the members filed out, their suits sharp, their press releases ready, Jasmine Crockett remained still. Not frozen, anchored. Somewhere deep in her chest, she felt the quiet ache of a woman who had just dragged truth into the light and was still unsure if the country had truly looked. She didn't celebrate. She didn't pose. She didn't even speak to reporters lining the hall. She just walked. Down the steps of the Capitol, past the velvet ropes and bulletproof glass, past the tourists who whispered her name like a question, past the aides who smiled too politely. She moved like someone carrying a weight no headline could measure. Like someone who knew that signing a bill didn't fix a country that had been sick for 400 years. She walked alone. Her heels echoed across the concrete like seconds ticking on borrowed time. It was almost midnight. The sky above D.C. was a dark, soft blue, like a bruise fading in reverse. And somewhere in the distance, the echo of the crowd still murmured. The hashtags were still climbing. Number, letter, speak. Justice takes time. We saw her. But Jasmine didn't check her phone. She didn't need to. The real reckoning wasn't digital. It was spiritual. It was inside. She turned down a side corridor, toward a statue she passed often but rarely looked at. Mary McLeod Bethune, cast in bronze, one hand clutching a cane, the other reaching out. Jasmine stopped, faced her, and whispered, "I'm trying." That was the truth. She wasn't celebrating. She was surviving. Because what this country calls progress, women like her have always had to drag, step by step through mud and resistance. And even in victory, she had learned the same brutal lesson over and over again. In America, change isn't handed down from power. It's yanked from its grip, one finger at a time. Jasmine sat on the edge of the nearby bench, folded her arms and let her mind wander, not into speeches or strategies, but into the places she rarely let anyone see. She thought of her cousin Jamal, thought of the night he didn't come home, the night they told her he matched a description, the night she saw his face on a mugshot, even though he had done nothing. She thought of the funeral, the way the priest's voice cracked on the phrase, "taken too soon," the way the air inside the church felt too thick to breathe. She thought of the mothers who had hugged her in hallways after hearings, the ones who didn't ask for selfies, just silence, just eye contact, just one moment where someone in power didn't look away from their pain. She thought of the folder she dropped in the middle of the hearing, and how for a split second, the room finally stopped performing and started listening. How truth, raw and undisguised, can pierce through any title, any party, any script. And she thought of Tim Scott, not as a rival, not even as a Republican, but as a man who had seen enough pain that he no longer knew where to put it. A man who had chosen the law to protect the house he built inside the system, while Jasmine had chosen it to burn down the parts that made her invisible. They weren't enemies, but they were never the same. And that was the other lesson. You can stand next to someone and still live in two different Americas. One where the badge means safety, and one where it means keep your hands where I can see them. One where the courtroom is justice, and one where it's a funeral delayed by paperwork. One where emotion is called passion, and one where it's called a threat. And no bill, not even this one, could bridge that chasm. Jasmine leaned back, let the cool stone meet her spine, and stared at the dome glowing above her like an indifferent moon. People were already calling her a hero, a reformer, a trailblazer. She hated those words. Not because they weren't true, but because they were armor. Armor people used to protect themselves from the real story, that she had to bleed for every inch of that bill, that she had to endure being called too angry, too radical, too unprofessional, just to be allowed to speak about dead children, that she had to be better than everyone in the room, twice as calm, 3 times as prepared, just to be seen as barely enough. That was the cost. And if there was one truth she wanted this country to finally confront, it was this. You don't get to ask people to smile while they're on fire. You don't get to demand grace from the people you've ignored. You don't get to call it unity when what you really want is silence. She rose slowly. Her bones ached, not with age, but with memory. She stepped back into the hallway, passing the words etched above the entrance to the rotunda. E pluribus unum, out of many one. She paused, scoffed softly under her breath. Out of many, she whispered, some are still fighting to count. And that was the human lesson, that laws are easy to sign, but empathy can't be legislated. That justice isn't about majority votes. It's about majority conscience. That some wounds require more than policy. They require confession, accountability, and time. And until this country could do that, Jasmine knew this wasn't the end. It was the first breath before the next battle. And yet, even as Jasmine walked into the darkness outside the Capitol, something burned brighter than any headline. It wasn't relief. It wasn't triumph. It was resolve. The kind forged not in celebration, but in fire. Because she knew the cameras would move on. The news cycle would spin. The hashtags would cool. And most of the people clapping in that chamber would go back to their comfortable routines, satisfied that something had been done. But Jasmine wasn't satisfied. She couldn't be, because she had looked injustice in the eye, and it didn't flinch. It never does. So if you're watching this story unfold from your home, your phone, your silence, know this. The time for empathy alone is over. This isn't about feeling bad. It's about being brave. It's about choosing discomfort over distance, truth over tolerance, and action over applause. Jasmine didn't endure humiliation, compromise, and heartbreak so the public could nod, share a post, and move on. She stood in that chamber for the people who never got a hearing. She spoke for the boy who never made it to graduation. She bled, quietly, gracefully, for those who were taught that speaking too loudly was a crime. And now it's your turn, not to admire her, not to quote her, but to become a part of what she started. If you're tired of watching videos of unarmed black men dying in the streets, then stop being a spectator. If you're exhausted by the outrage cycle that begins at the funeral and ends with inaction, then change the ending. If you've ever said that's not who we are, then prove it, because the truth is, this is who we've been. And it'll stay that way until you do something more than watch. So here's where you begin. Not in Washington, not on Twitter, but in your community, your neighborhood, your city council, your police oversight board. Find out who makes the policies where you live, and don't stop until those policies reflect the dignity of every life. Write your representatives. Sit in the hearings no one live streams. Don't wait for the next tragedy to learn the name of your police chief. Call your school board. Ask what they're teaching your children about justice, about history, about humanity. Because change isn't made in applause. It's made in pressure. And yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it's messy. Yes, it means losing friends, making enemies, and standing alone sometimes. But Jasmine Crockett stood alone. She was mocked, undermined, sidelined, and still she showed up. Still she spoke. Still she wrote legislation with the same hands that once clenched at the news of her cousin's death. So what's your excuse? You don't need to be a lawmaker. You don't need to have a platform. You just need to decide that your silence isn't worth more than someone else's life. You just need to stop waiting for someone else to do it, because the law didn't change by itself. It didn't bend out of mercy. It bent because someone pushed. Jasmine pushed. And now it's your turn to carry it forward, because laws without hearts are useless, and hearts without courage are dangerous. So start with your heart. Unlearn what you've been told. Challenge the jokes you once laughed at. Interrupt the conversations where injustice hides behind politeness. Be louder than the systems that depend on your silence. Refuse to look away. Refuse to normalize the abnormal. Refuse to be numb. And if you're a teacher, teach truth, even when it shakes the room. If you're a parent, raise your children to see color, not ignore it. If you're a police officer, listen harder, train better, and speak out even if your badge tells you not to. If you're white, understand that allyship is not applause, it's action. If you're black, understand that your rage is not only valid, it's necessary. This country was not changed by civility. It was changed by confrontation. So confront. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.